So I'll kick off by introducing Rebecca Braun. Rebecca, I've known Rebecca for many years, actually. Great to see you, great to have you. Thanks for agreeing to participate in our webinar. So Rebecca studied French and German at Oxford University, and she completed her doctorate in German literature in 2006. And the resulting monograph, Constructing Authorship in the Work of Günter Grass, was published by Oxford University Press in 2008. She's currently Professor of Modern Languages and Creative Futures, that's quite some title, at the University of Lancaster. And her research focuses on world authorship, literary prizes, celebrification, German literature in a transnational context, and the literary industry more generally speaking. So I have to admit somebody here. She is one of the editors of German Life and Letters, a journal in which we have all Germanists amongst us have published and continue to publish, a leading journal of German studies in the Anglophone world. Rebecca is also co-editor with Ben Schofield of a forthcoming volume, Transnational German Studies, which will appear with Liverpool University Press in 2020. And she is co-editor of a volume on world authorship with Thomas Boes and Emily Spears, which will come out, or has come out with Oxford
in September.
Has come out, exactly, did come out in September 2019 with Oxford University Press. So Rebecca, we are delighted that you're here and that you will talk to us today about when is the nation and where is the human for provocations. I'm handing over to you, and thanks again for contributing to our webinar.
Thank you so much, and yes, thanks for inviting me. It's been a really interesting morning so far, and I'm looking forward to learning more. So my talk is going to be perhaps a little bit more practice focused than some of the talks we heard earlier. I took my cue from Joe, actually, who was interested in transnational German studies and said it would be interesting to hear some thoughts on that. So I'm kind of taking the experience of editing, and we're putting together a project that sets out to look at the transnational in all sorts of different ways, and reflecting on that, reflecting on what I've learned about what I think the transnational is at the end of that experience. And I in fact signed off on the index yesterday, so it's very much at the fore of my mind. So the Transnational German Studies is part of the Transnational Modern Languages series, which has been initiated by a number of people, in particular Charles Burdett, who's at Durham University, and had a large grant to look at transnationalizing Italian studies, I guess. And he kind of put together this whole idea of looking at modern languages, and this idea of looking at nations from outside or beyond or in different places to where one usually looks for nations that are the subject of our different language areas. So it's turned into a whole series with Liverpool University Press, where there's one handbook looking at transnationalizing modern languages, what that means in terms of concepts and ideas. And then we have the different language volumes, and the Transnational German Studies is one of those. We've been given a reasonable amount of leeway to do what we want within that general structure, but we do all have 4 parts to our volume. And I was going to share with you the table of contents for it, which I think I can hopefully do by just plopping it in the chat. Will that work? Can I just pop it into the chat, do you think? So you'll just have to take my word that there are four sections, and we've got 4 chapters in each looking at what transnational German studies might mean. And I'll talk you through how we've gone about this then. So when we were first approached about the TML series, Ben and I were very wary of simply equating the transnational with globalization, or indeed cosmopolitanism, as it tends to get taken in quite a kind of presentist form. I used the term a little differently to how Anna meant it. What I suppose we mean forgetting about the past and tending to think that we're in a particular moment in the present going into the future, but largely dispensing with earlier forms that might be relevant. So we were particularly allergic to this tendency towards presentism and arguments about increased connectivity and speed defining the 21st century. We thought that that was a bit of a reductive way of thinking about what it might mean to have a transnational approach to German studies. So as our point of departure, we decided to interrogate both the trans and the national of transnational. We took literally the idea of trans meaning across, through, between, before, and beyond, as we thought through what all these different nuances would mean for trying to catch a discrete subject of study that's traditionally been seen as bound to a relatively confined space and affiliated linguistic community. So we were really keen to sort of bring out, well, what is German studies when you're not just looking at the obvious Germany, Austria, Switzerland, where can that take you? And if you look at it at different time periods, what happens? We use Germany's difficulty with the question of nation as a way of going right back. So Germany only sort of really officially becomes a nation state, obviously in 1871. We wanted to go right back to find the transnational before, during, and beyond the national. This was particularly one of Ben's ideas that, you know, perhaps the transnational can come before the nation state, as well as somehow questioning and unpicking it and being what comes after. And we also asked not just where is German, but when is German? And that was the starting point of this talk, of course. When is that nation? And we asked ourselves repeatedly why anybody whose job isn't directly to research German studies should care. So we really had a sense, we do actually also have to think about why does any of this matter anyway? So by doing this, we found ourselves applying 3 lenses to the question. Oh, fantastic, well done, Anne, you're better than I am. 3 lenses to the question, what is German studies? And the lenses are the trans-period, the translational, and the transdisciplinary. And all of these, I think, can bear on the humanities more broadly. So I've used them to structure my talk in thinking about what does it mean to do transnational humanities. So the transnationalist transperiod, first of all, going back in time before the nation state and adopting a transperiod take on our subject of study means being really open to what we class as relevant objects of study. So not just the history of the German language and literature, which is sort of the obvious starting point for anybody working in modern languages, but looking at the history of religious practices, major trade routes. So the Hanseatic League is particularly important in pre-modern times in Germany. Gendered social practices and how you can find them in when you go back into the historical archives. Material objects from churches to printing presses. All of these are fantastically interesting and part of German culture in all sorts of ways, going right back into early modern and medieval times. And one of the things that we were really keen to do is to think through then, how do you construct a network of meaning that is multi-directional, multi-actor, so allows for this huge richness that you can find when you start to look at German in a more historical way. But it nevertheless coheres around the shared characteristic of being in some way German, even as it runs through and beyond any essential or exclusive notion of Germanness that we might think of in a more kind of modern nation state kind of way. And the first chapter in the volume, Elizabeth Anderson's, which you can just scroll to the top of the screen to see that, it really gives it a flavour of this. So she brings out the fact that Low German, because of the importance of the Hanseatic trade routes, Low German is a kind of lingua franca in the way that Latin is, and she traces how different forms of culture, material culture and literary culture translate back and forth between Low German, High German, Latin, and bring in influences from France and other neighbouring countries in a way that, you know, one might think is really that kind of transcultural exchange we might think is a very kind of contemporary phenomenon, and she shows just how far back it goes and gives a really interesting new angle on what German is in the process, and so linguistically looking at Low German. So we were really keen that the volume would open up new perspectives on what studying German means for anybody. We wanted to give our students, and indeed other disciplinary readers who were lured in, something that would give them not only a much bigger world than they might have been expecting, and people do tend to think just German, it's World War II and what follows, but also a number of different worlds to give them alternative ways of being and shape their sense of how they in turn might orient themselves in the world. And we could bookend, if you're just looking through the table of contents, we're at the bottom there with Stuart's chapter. He actually relativizes national identity by looking into the future, and deals particularly with thinking about some of the issues that Anne was raising, actually. So when questions of German identity have been rather relativized by questions of planetary identity and a sort of the threat to the end of the Anthropocene, as it were. Okay, so this leads me to the first provocation I wanted to make, which is that thinking about what we've learned from that is that we should always locate ourselves across time, but in relation to our time. So the humanities are trying to somehow allow for the huge richness of our fields of study, not get bogged down in particular areas and lose sight of the bigger picture, but we do also then have to relate it to our time, because that is where a lot of people's interest actually lies. And I would say this provocation points us to thinking not just about the critical humanities and critique, which I think we're all schooled in, but the confident humanities. It takes confidence to believe that you're able to do this and to join up all the dots in meaningful ways. So there's a real need for humanities scholarship to be bold enough to take this big sweep across large timeframes without fearing the loss of specificity or detail, and that's obviously a challenge. So second point, second lens, the transnational as translational. One of the second real things that we wanted to achieve with this volume is to put it across in accessible language. In that sense, be translational, have your work and your study speak to all sorts of other people. And that raises the question as to how much complexity is needed for a subject to be opened up to further inquiry, as you know, a postgraduate student in German might then take up. So we want to obviously put some ideas out there that are going to really feel rich and fecund for engaging with. But we also want to encourage fruitful comparisons that take the whole subject itself to other places, so that a researcher in a cognate discipline will be able to do something with it. And that also requires not putting too much detail and complexity in, because then it becomes off-putting. A criticism made of humanities scholarship since the high theory years of the late 20th century has been its tendency towards jargon and hermeticism. And we really wanted to avoid that, whilst remaining very alert to the nuances of language, space, time, and subjectivity. Those are the four parts we were given to work with that have been the focus of those identity politics and the related linguistic, spatial, and temporal turns. So this is another kind of juggling act. How can we put together a volume that feels like it's really doing justice to the richness and complexity of the subject, but at the same time is accessible to people coming in at all entry levels and from various different disciplinary standpoints? And I point in that context to Angus Nichol's chapter on Freud, which gives a sense of how one can be translational by literally looking at translation. So he looks at how Freud has been translated in the early years from German to English, and what happened when those translations were undertaken. Freud's quite literary language, and some in that sense kind of quite artistic language, becomes quite medicalized in the translations in English, and sort of knocks him into a rather different field, in fact, to the one that he was perhaps drawing on when he was establishing his ideas. And those English translations have been massively influential for what we think Freudian research and Freudian scholarship is all about. So it was sort of himself both making Freud available to people from other disciplines, and making the matter of translation visible to scholars in, you know, the medical side of campus, if you like, and also perhaps critiquing some of the slippages that can happen. as part of opening up what modern languages scholarship is and who it speaks to, we also felt really strongly the importance of giving space to collaborators from other parts of the world. So we actually found ourselves asking at one point, should we be transnationalizing our contributors? And we thought, on balance, yes, we should, because they have important insights from where they stand on what German studies is, and they bring other ways of doing things, including just at a very basic level, kind of ways of presenting a scholarly argument. We might not be as transnational as we'd like to be, but we made a real effort to go in the right direction. We got a scholar from France, Dirk Weissmann. That sounds a bit German, but he's actually French. And you might think that's not really going very far away from Germany and being very ambitious, but there is quite a difference actually. And I was quite struck by the fact that the scholarship that happens in the Romance languages on German stuff, I think, is largely invisible to people in the English-speaking world, and that's a huge pity and waste. So he'd written a really insightful chapter, in fact, on people writing in German as a second language. And we had Paulo Soto from Brazil, who I met through a Humboldt network, giving a really interesting insight into archives of German language newspapers in the Americas, and the challenges of trying to keep those accessible today, and what they show about 19th century patterns of movement. And just to kind of mention in passing some of the challenges that this throws up, we had a contributor from India who we were really excited to have on board, who we thought was going to bring a fantastic sort of Indian take on East-West relations, which was very different to what we were able to give through our own networks. And he had to drop out because of climate change. And it seems quite important to mention that in this context, that that the air pollution had got so bad when his chapter was due, he simply wasn't able to work. And these are some of the things we don't generally talk about when we're sort of theorizing transnational humanities, but there are some really important practical ramifications to think through. If we genuinely want to be connected up in different ways and bringing in different viewpoints, it causes challenges for how we work, and the kind of timeframes we're working to, and what we expect as a sort of a standard scholarly piece. So my second provocation then is that how we say things must always go right through what we say. So in that sense, transnational, methodologically, we have to really own it, and it has to inform the way that we're setting out what we're doing, whether it's using more accessible language or being ourselves more accessible and putting together more inclusive networks. That seems it's really got to be a pillar of the transnational humanities. So this points to not getting stuck in your own nationally bounded networks and somewhat self-perpetuating vocabulary, perhaps. Perpetuating the discipline means communicating it in such a way that it has the core ability to go beyond itself. In that sense, transnational goes beyond the nation, and to carry on moving through time and into different worlds and communities, and indeed to be inflected by other takes on, from different worlds and communities. So I'm conscious of time. How much longer do you want me to talk for, Anna? 2 minutes. Brilliant. That brings me to my third provocation, transnational as transdisciplinary. We wanted the book to point forwards to new ways of doing things. Often handbooks are a little bit kind of summative, and they sort of say this is where we've got to so far, and they don't feel very cutting edge. The whole series is trying to change the way we think about where modern languages sits in universities. So we wanted to point to new ways of doing things, including explicit reflections on methodology that are both core. So I think everybody in modern languages would see philology, archive work, close textual analysis as core to the discipline, and we've got lots and lots of examples of those. But also sort of outlier methodologies, and in particular, we've got a bit of a cluster of expertise around social network analysis and actor network theory. Quite a few of the chapters reference that. So when you start to take on different methodologies and take them seriously and engage with them in their own terms, rather than just kind of cherry picking some terms, sometimes this can include shifting the gaze away from humans and the qualitative traces they leave of their cultural endeavours. And I think that has really been the homeland of humanities research, has obviously been humans and thinking about the qualitative traces of culture. But to shift the gaze away from that, and prioritize other things. We've already heard this morning about post-humanism and material culture in some ways, but just to really push that a bit more. Sometimes the methodologies needed for this, they're not a clever conceptual move, they can be quite mechanistic, and Sarah Jones's chapter just takes the reader really simply by the hand to show how you use computer software to do social network analysis in order to understand from a different perspective, to use a different way in to looking at how different museums and bodies tasked with remembering or creating German, goodness, somebody's ringing me on my watch. Go away. Sorry, so she uses social network analysis, and she talks the reader through how that works, how you run the computer program, and it's quite mechanistic. The interest and value in this is in the different kinds of questions that it allows us to ask. So brings me to my third provocation. I'm going to stop with just three. The humanities need to show humility and be alert to learning from other ways of doing things, that sometimes the methods that you need to engage with are not necessarily sort of amazingly exciting new theories, but they can really help you ask different questions in a different way. So this points to don't shun simple methods. Reflect on what the learnable techniques are that are germane to the humanities, but which other disciplines could take up. And that's been a real sort of guiding thing that we tried to bring out. What are the methods that we use in our work that are actually quite simple? And can we put them simply rather than making them complicated? And what are methods that are used in other disciplines that, you know, are simple enough for us to be able to take and work with and in a creative way to bring about new forms of knowledge and open things up to people in new ways. So I'm going to stop there. Only 3 provocations, I'm afraid, but hopefully that's given us food for thought.
Okay, thanks very much, Rebecca, for kind of analyzing the methodological scaffolding underpinning this volume and addressing some of the issues that, you know, that come with this territory. Now, you can, of course, mention your 4th provocation in the conversation. Yeah, can I invite some comments and questions? I will start then, while others, you know, as you know, we all have our thinking hats on, and so I'll return your provocation and say, what's new about this? Haven't we been doing this type of transdisciplinary work for a long time? I grew up with it. I would say I was trained by reception theory in the 1980s, and I've been engaging with these kind of questions since my undergraduate years. So is the transnational just a label, or to what extent does it really mean a new methodology that is not just interdisciplinary? So that's my provocation, returning it to you.
It's always dangerous, isn't it, to claim you're doing anything new, ever. I mean, it's dangerous to claim you're ever writing about anything new if you're an author as well. And I think one needs healthy skepticism to the terminology. And indeed, as I said, Ben and I didn't start out loving the idea of the transnational. We started out by thinking, well, what can we make it do for us? I guess if I was trying to say what I think is not perhaps new about it, but timely about using the term transnational, is that it does flag up a desire to think economically and politically. I mean, at some level, transnationalism, I think, is surely aligned to a political and economic take on the world that we live in at the moment. And in taking this idea of the transnational and then bringing a humanities lens to it, we're trying to ask ourselves, how do the humanities contribute to that debate? And I think perhaps in earlier decades, that wasn't something that humanities scholarship felt it had to do. It was quite happy to look back and to look at the past and to open things out on its own terms. And I suppose, so it's more about a sort of a conscious sense of humanities scholarship is an important part of these current debates, and it brings an important perspective to current debates that are really shaping the economic and political form of the world and humanities. That's why I'm saying we need the confident humanities, that it's not new to us, and people shouldn't feel kind of like they have to learn a whole new approach. In many ways we've been doing most of this anyway, but it hasn't been joined up and it hasn't had that same sense of purpose. So that's what the term gives us, I think.
Okay, great. Gillian has a question. I'll read it out. Thanks, Rebecca. Great paper. Just a practical question. Can you say something about how this has changed your curriculum and the way you approach teaching?
Yeah, lovely. That's a really lovely question, and that is the aspiration behind the whole series, is that it will actually allow for a different way of thinking about modern languages across the different subjects. So it's changed my teaching in as much as I've already now got a transnational component in our core course for second years, and it's given me a framework for talking about lots of related things, migration and how it's played out across different periods. So this year I taught it, and we looked at Heinrich Heine as much as looking at Thomas Gardy and the very contemporary stuff, and encouraged the students to look across the period. So this trans period that I was telling you, we've got in the little mini modules, we found a way of getting students to do something that's comparatively old from their point of view and something that feels very contemporary, and look about what's the same and what's different. So it's really helpful for getting those points across quite succinctly, because you're always under pressure in the curriculum that you can't teach all the things you want, and you can only get them to do little bits and pieces here and there. But it's been a really helpful way of making it feel relevant for students, but opening up the older literatures as well.
Okay, thank you. Can I invite one other question, please? Yes, Enrica, you can unmute yourself.
I was about to write it, but it will take a shorter time if I just say it. So are there any hidden dangers in this transnationalizing the curriculum as they are possibly in decolonizing it?
I didn't hear the last bit, sorry.
Possibly in decolonizing the curriculum. Are there any hidden dangers in this, that we are leave aside, aspects, of our curriculum that, and so this is something that is kind of cyclical, we value certain aspects of our national heritage, of our culture, transnational culture, and we leave others aside. That's just to know your view on this.
I'm not sure I have a ready answer as to whether there are any obvious dangers. It feels like it's a really positive way to think about the discipline, to keep asking ourselves, how does it relate to everything else that people might be thinking, and how can the wider world, how can we use that to change what we're interested in when we think about German studies? That feels positive, but there was a sort of a fundamental paradox that we were slightly worried that we were putting together a textbook where we were saying all the really interesting stuff is not in Germany. For a subject that feels constantly under threat, we thought that's a slightly peculiar message to be sending out. That somehow being German isn't enough. So that was kind of something, and it's perhaps particularly the case in the German volume where you are a little bit on the back foot, that you don't have quite the right kudos for attracting students anymore. But I feel that that's something that we were able to balance that, right? So yeah, but I'll be interested to see. I'm sure we'll be tripped up somewhere.
Okay, and we have one more comment here from Britta. Britta is not asking a question, but I'll read it out. Going back to my question and your answer, I think also that by consciously using the term transnational, we break the normativity associated to some of the issues empowering other voices. And of course, that is intrinsically true, and I would agree with that. However, I think perhaps one issue that remains for me is the question of competency, especially when we teach our subjects. There has to be a core competency which involves the mastery of the language. and close critical reading. And it's quite a challenge to do all these things. I'm just putting this out there for all of us who are deeply involved with undergraduate students, yeah, that it's actually, it's not easy. It's not easy to deliver on the transnational curriculum. To be pursued another time.
Although I suppose maybe as a final remark, I really think one should never underestimate one's students. And, you know, I've been seeing that they come and they bring so much themselves to the classroom. If you can find a way of making them believe what they already know, and, you know, other ways of doing things they've got, whether it's from school or from another part of their joint degree, sometimes it can feel really empowering for them to believe that they're shaping it with you.
Yeah. Okay. Well, we are looking forward to the publication of the volume and your own contributions, of course, in this field. Rebecca, thank you very much for revealing the challenges and debating the challenges and the opportunities that come with this new way of approaching our diverse subject areas from a transnational perspective. So thanks very much. And I hope you can stay on for some of the other papers. So thanks very much.